Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our Center of Excellence presentations, our sort of 1 hour quick presentations on a number of different challenges that children face. My name is Gosztonyi, and here with me is Catherine Cora. We're coordinators of the Center of Excellence. I've worked for many years as a school psychologist and for the last 20 years with the Center of Excellence. And Catherine has worked in schools in many different roles. You want to tell them a little bit about yourself, Catherine?
My goodness, as a coordinator of a program for high school students that had actually fits in right into this topic. And I've, as a behavior consultant, and I've also worked in private practice with parents who come to me for these types of challenges as well. So we'll have tons of examples to bring to you.
Yes. And with no further ado, then I will share my screen. And oh, good, I'm on the right slide. So we're talking today about teaching the student who is defended and hard to reach. And these are some of our most difficult students. And what I'm hoping today is to kind of share with you again a way of looking at them through the usual lenses that we use with the Neufeld paradigm, which are maturation, vulnerability, attachment, and emotions, and really trying to get a sense for what is going on with these students. We see behaviors that are very concerning to us, especially because we're all there. We want to help these kids. We know that if we just get through to them, that we'd be able to help them. But these are the kinds of kids who they don't like to come to class. They don't even we try and connect with them, and they kind of push us off. They have a hard time getting started or completing their work. They don't seem to be paying attention. They're kind of prickly. They react negatively to simple requests, and they're abrupt, and they kind of, and they keep everything inside. We know there's a lot going on, but they won't talk to us about it. Some of them just literally shut down, put their head on their desk, pull the hoodie over their heads, just won't even look at us. Interestingly enough, they even sometimes like turn on us after a time of positive connection. I'll talk about that in a moment. They're impatient with their peers. They seem tired and unmotivated. Sometimes they even really seem depressed. Or they can all of a sudden be very quiet for days on end and then just blow up out of the blue, storm out of the room. And the younger ones can find places to hide. The older ones try sometimes very, very hard not to be noticed. So these kids get at us. They're not always the ones that we notice, but when we do notice them, we have concerns. And what I want to share with you today is all that's underneath that iceberg. We see they're troubled, but it's really a story of elevated emotion, with a whole lot of issues around facing separation and being stuck in that mode. They lost their feelings and they get stuck in a defensive response. And I'll show you in a moment what that is. And then there's missing feelings because emotions move us and move us through our immaturity into maturity, and they're stuck in that as well. And so they've got troubled emotions, troubled behavior, troubled thinking, and troubled functioning. So they really are, many of them, we would, in the previous presentations that I've given around trauma, these are actually our trauma kids. But many of them, again, with our trauma kids, sometimes it's really, really obvious, but with some of these kids, it's not that obvious, these students. But, they have the typical kinds of things. If you went through this list and thought about that child, you'd probably find many of what's on this list in their lives. Parents not living together or getting along, multiple parents, step parents, even being in foster care, frequent hospitalizations when they were very young, sick family members. Even adoption is a huge issue for many of our kids, siblings, death in the family, high sensitivity, and we will refer to that as well, because some of these students are kind of skirting on the autism spectrum, high sensitivity spectrum, and that affects them as well. Just never feeling that they're good enough. And as I mentioned, we really just look more deeply into the adverse family conditions, and many of them have multiple of those boxes checked off. So facing separation is the biggest issue for us as human beings, and our brain is actually moved to fix the problem. And emotion is what it is that moves us. I will not say the same things that I've said in other presentations. If you're interested in how the brain works, please go and look at our presentation on alarmed and disrupted, and the one on trauma, because there are many things in there. So, but there is this movement that's coming from our brain for when we are facing separation, and these emotions are really there to kind of fix the emotion. And these are good emotions, by the way. We tend to get hung up on the negative parts, and I'm going to show you what happens when these emotions get stuck. But they're wonderful. When we're facing separation, the most natural thing to do is to try and restore proximity, reach out to that person. Is there some reason you haven't called me? Have I done something to offend you? We just reach out. Pursuit is about reaching out and reconnecting. It also can be that we, when we're facing separation, we sort of slow ourselves down. As many of you know, I'm a very enthusiastic person. I tend sometimes to talk in a little bit of a loud and enthusiastic voice. I've learned over time that that can be upsetting to some people. So there's some people with whom I kind of use a more gentle voice, because I know that I just have to do that to keep the relationship functioning. And then frustration, which we tend to see as really a negative emotion. And the reason we see it as a negative emotion is because it is such a powerful emotion, but it is meant to help us to change things that aren't working. Sometimes we have to let somebody else know, my friends might have to let me know, Eva, when you talk loud like that, I know you don't mean so, but it bothers me. I get upset. I have a hard time listening to you because of the way in which you're speaking, not because of what you're saying. Oh, well, thank you for the feedback. I appreciate that. So frustration is meant to help us to change things. But because it's such a powerful emotion, it can very easily move into attack. But we have to respect it for what it is. Now, these emotions are very intense, usually felt one at a time, and they can displace one another, but they're still there. And they usually will be expressed at another time in another place. And so we need to hold on to that thought, because what we're really saying here is that emotions are underneath the waterline, the iceberg. There's a lot of iceberg under there. If we use alarm as an example, when our alarm is engaged, there's adrenaline, cortisol, heart rate, blood pressure. These are all engaged to move us to do what we have to do. If my friend says speak more quietly, now I'm going to be more actively thinking about speaking quietly. So it seems contradictory, but that's what happens, let alone if something really scares me and I have to go and save myself. But an emotion is not a feeling until it rises to our consciousness. When it rises to our consciousness, usually we're able to name it in some way, but we can also show non-verbally that we're actually experiencing that emotion by kind of the way our eyes look or whatever. But normally it's around being able to say some words that indicate that I'm in touch with what's going on in my unconscious world. But emotions are not always felt. They're not always felt, but they still exist. And when there is too much emotion going on, and again, right at this moment in time in 2022, we are still living in the midst of a global pandemic that's been going on for over 2 years. There's still, when we all know what it felt like when there was so much alarm in our system. What is this thing? What are we supposed to do? How am I supposed to wash my hands? Did I wash my hands well enough? And was my mask on in the right? Was everybody else? I mean, we had a lot of emotion inside of us. And at some point, our brain said, okay, you just got to numb this out. You've got to numb it out. And so the brain protects us and the emotion is suppressed. But as a result, we have less feelings, and we have seen people who show no fear for certain kinds of things. Now, why does our brain protect us? Well, it keeps us from being overwhelmed by that which makes us feel too vulnerable or too wounded. So we have too much separation, too much shame, or too much alarm. These come in, now the shell gets put on. And by the way, this has been noted by neuroscientists. I'll share that name in a moment. But it basically comes when we feel it's not safe to depend or to be vulnerable. It's not safe to express what we're feeling, or in the experience of sensitivity, the world is overwhelming and no one can keep me safe. And much of this is related to adverse childhood experiences or too much sensitivity. So it's meant the shell is meant to go on. so that we can function. All of you, when you walked into the school, you kind of had to put a shell on and deal with the pandemic as if it wasn't quite as serious as you felt it in your heart. But you had to put that shell on, and actually it happened naturally. It's meant to protect us when there's too much vulnerability to bear. And Bessel van der Kolk is a neuroscientist who has pulled together all the research on this, and we can see it in the brain. Defenses are not just an idea that was, developed by psychoanalysts, 120 years ago. It now can be seen in the brain. But they're meant to be employed situationally and temporarily. And defenses are automatic, not willfully controlled. Now, what's meant to happen is we put the shell on so we can keep from getting hurt, so we can go into a circumstance where it might be a bit difficult. It's necessary, but it should be temporary, but there has to be an end of the day when the feelings can come back. And some of you have children for whom this happens very naturally. They're perfect at school. I had a daughter like that, perfect at school. Came home and was an emotional mess because her end of the day was getting back with mommy. And when she came back with mommy, all of a sudden the defenses melted and the emotions came out. First, it was often attack because she had a lot of frustration in her life. And then the tears come. And we know that the softening has happened when the tears have come. So when we go back to too much separation, let's look at all the things that can happen when that softening doesn't actually occur, when that shell stays on. Now pursuit becomes intensified. Alarm becomes heightened. Frustration becomes foul. Intensified pursuit, we don't usually notice in young children, but those of you working with adolescents, you're already seeing this. With the young children, it's about wanting to be first, desperately seeking attention, taking things, possessing things, or being too good. And we start noticing, oh my goodness, these kids are being way too good, and it's starting to cause them problems. With the heightened alarm, we see anxiety, obsessions, compulsions, agitation, hyperactivity, attention problems, and then moving into alarm reduction, which often means trying to find ways in which to calm ourselves down. And with our teenagers, sadly, very often it is around using substances. With foul frustration, this is where the tantrums, the screaming, the hitting, the attacking, all the different ways of attacking other people happens, but also the self-attack. So when we can't resolve facing separation or can't have, the tears about what we can't fix, then these are all the things that start to happen. And these are often the behaviors that we will notice with these children from time to time, with these students from time to time. But there's a whole nother layer with them in our presentations on alarmed and disruptive students, and in our students who are frustration and aggression and tantruming kids. They were often stuck at this level. But when the brain really wants to protect itself, it puts on more levels of protection, and then there become even more intense behaviors. So the behaviors start, all sorts of behaviors start coming out that really cause us problems. And this is what I find absolutely fascinating. And again, this is all based on the work of Dr. Neufeld as he tried to understand why students were behaving, why people behave the way that they behave. And again, it's all comes back to in facing separation, too much separation. So one of the things that can happen when we really can't resolve it is we start going into a number of other different factors. One is called defensive reattachment. Defensive reattachment means I still have attachment needs, but I'm going to attach to something that makes me feel less vulnerable. And I'll get into that in a moment. Or we can go into defensive dominance, or we can go into flight from vulnerability. So defensive detachment, what happens here is we attach to something else that seems to make us less vulnerable. Peers, as we know, are not the ideal attachment mode, but boy, there's a lot of them around, and they're easy to connect with. And so our many of our students who are hard to reach are desperately involved with their peers, or and therefore they have attention problems, and they often have opposition problems. Defensive reattachment also, if we look with students on the autism spectrum, they can become reattached to objects, to things, to routines. Kids can get attached to their iPads, social media. So there's many things that meet these attachment needs at a very superficial level. When you are facing too much separation to bear, one of the things that happens is you go into defensive dominance, which is basically really the way in which the brain says to other people, you aren't taking care of me. Thank you very much. I'm going to take care of myself. And this is when students and children become bossy. They start telling adults what to do. They refuse to listen because they know better. And they can even go as far as bullying, which is basically, I'm going to show you that I'm tough before you take advantage of me. And so this defensive dominance is a way of dealing, because remember, attachment is all about caring about and being cared for. But when a child doesn't feel cared for, they are going to find ways in which to get their attachment needs met, but in a way that makes them feel less vulnerable. The third way of dealing with this is what we call flight from vulnerability. And we're going to use sort of psychological terms called defensive detachment, because it really is, and you'll notice the word defensive here. There are big defenses, big walls that are being put up. And I'll show you in a moment kind of some of the specific ones that you will see with your students. But it basically means that my world is too scary. I've got to put a great big shell on, and I've got to push everything away that makes me feel vulnerable. So they are going to, in that mode, they are very often the kind of student that ignores us. They shut down, they push adults away. As a result, they have attention problems because it's hard for them to pay attention to anything that makes them feel vulnerable. And they are going to let us know what they like and what they don't like in a very clear way. It's certainly, we often call that being oppositional. Now, what I'm going to share with you here basically is the whole picture of what could be going on with these students. And not every one of the students is going to manifest every one of these things, but this is what is all swirling around underneath them because they've experienced too much separation. And one of the things that's really interesting here is I had a psychologist one time say to me, I'm going into high school and I don't know if I'm going to be able to meet the needs of the high school students. I mean, they have so many diagnoses, because by the way, I could put a whole bunch of diagnoses on here as well. So what am I going to do? I said, remember, the biggest problem that these students have is that they've had too much separation. And the biggest gift you can give them is a relationship with you. Because when we remove separation from the middle, we can go, wow, there's no way we can deal with all of that. No way. There's way too many problems here to deal with. And it is not easy. But when we realize that the response to facing separation is attachment, then actually we can start to make a little bit of a difference. And again, I'm going to give Catherine, I have sort of a goal here, Catherine, to get to a certain slide. But again, both of us have worked with students where other people have said, you're never going to get through to them. But when we figured out what it is that they needed, it was amazing the kind of changes that we saw. So let's just go back to looking at some of these mechanisms of defense. And we've looked at two of them when we looked at the alarmed and disruptive student. And basically, there's a numbing out of vulnerable feelings. And so there are emotional problems that are happening there. There's also tuning out the perceptions that lead to vulnerable feelings, which also then lead to emotional problems. And I'll talk about these in a moment. And then there's the third level of tuning out that we're looking at today that really confuse us, are what we call reversing the instincts that set the stage for vulnerable thoughts and feelings. And this results in motivational problems. And I'm going to show you how that works. So let's just look at the first one. Basically the emotional defense, and we can tell that a student is an emotional defense because they don't seem to be aware of emotions that most of us have. They're the ones that basically walked in even at the beginning of the pandemic and said, oh, there's nothing to be scared about. I don't know, like there should be some alarm there. Even they can't even name frustration, even though they do attack. I'm not frustrated, they say as they're attacking. And they definitely have huge problems with feeling the sadness about, and sadness should move us to dealing with all the things that we cannot change. But remember, even though the emotions are not being felt and talked about, they are still there. And the agitation is still there, but there's no apprehension, but the chemistry is still around. When you put on the next level of defense, the attention is directed away from that which would give rise to vulnerable feelings. And we call this defensive blindness. These are the kinds of students that keep walking into trouble. They will keep talking when the teacher is talking. They will walk down the part of the hallway that no other kid walks down because they know that the bullies are there and everybody else finds another way to get to where they're supposed to go. But these kids walk right into the middle of it. You can't see trouble coming. They have a hard time focusing, especially when it's going to have vulnerable feelings. And we're going to talk in a moment about what education is all about, looking at what makes us feel vulnerable, because we have to learn things that we don't know. And so they have attention problems, because when you have an attention problem, now you don't get things done, you get into trouble. They have difficulty with understanding that sometimes they're not invited to be friends with other students. They can't even look at their own mistakes. They can't think about what they did wrong. And sometimes they can't even remember things that happened in their life that really were hurtful. And again, it's hard to work with someone who can't see what the problem is. Now, the third level of defenses is what our hard and defended and hard to reach students sometimes find themselves in. And this is when we call this reversing attachment instincts that give rise to vulnerable feelings. So they basically reverse the need for proximity through defensive detachment because it's too scary to be in attachment. Attachment. What if the person I want to be attached to doesn't want to be attached to me? But attachment is actually one of the ways in which students are motivated. You all know you have students that will only work for you because they're attached to you. But these students don't even often have that as a way of engaging in difficult things like learning. And they're going to actively push away those who are meant to care for them because it's too scary. It is just too scary. And they also reverse the instincts to depend by being bossy and controlling and bullying. Dr. Neufeld tells us we have to realize that attachment and is not just about or like a lack of attachment or a defense against attachment isn't just about refusing attachment, it's also about pushing it away. And this is that negative polarity. And I'll leave you to read this on your own. What happens here, and we have to remember as well that these students still want to need attachments. So they're going to desperately seek superficial relationships to meet those attachment needs. And as a result, we often will find ourselves on the other end of the attachment magnet when they're attached to their peers, when they're attached to their iPad, when they're attached to their social media, when they're attached to their obsessions. We are going to be on the other side of that magnet, and they are not going to want to listen to us or be motivated by us. So there's a huge impact of defendedness on relationships because these kids are not easy for us to relate to. It's going to be hard to collect the student. They won't give us a lot of eye contact. They'll ignore us. They're going to, even when we make contact, they're going to give us a scowl. They're going to mumble, say rude things under their breath. When things are going well, and this is the paradox of attachment, because the more I want to be attached to someone, the deeper my attachment goes, the more sensitive I am to rejection. And so sometimes when they've had a really good period of attachment, all of a sudden it flips and goes into that kind of black negative polarity of attachment because it just feels too scary. And so they'll be calling you names and telling you that and saying things to you like, oh, you're just like everybody else and you don't care about me. And you've just finished doing a whole bunch of stuff for them. But what they're basically saying is, this is getting scary for me. And they might even mock or mimic or imitate you, make fun of you. They might lash out all of a sudden out of the blue, because remember, there's that whole sea of emotion under there that has no way of coming out. And so a minor incident can turn into a huge big deal. And they can start accusing everybody of being mean, even though people have been very, very patient with their difficult behaviors. So they find themselves in this and a vicious circle, which starts with separation alarm, goes into deep defendedness. Now it manifests in alienating behavior. Now the adult gets upset. Now we start to having to discipline them because they're going against the school code, and around and around and around it goes. This defensive armor, although it's necessary, if it stays on too long, means we lose playfulness. It actually affects our maturity. And again, go back and listen to the presentation on trauma where I share the research about how the brain is affected when there is too many defenses going on. They're less flexible. They're more rigid. They can't bounce back from things. Everything they get stuck in just ruminating over and over again about what went wrong and what somebody said and what they did. They lose their empathy and caring, which of course means now there's more wounding interactions. But one of the things I always think about with these students is they basically say, I can't care about you because I have to take care of myself because no one is taking care of me. And as a result, they risk losing caring attachments. And then they have all this other host of problems. And then remember, they are in school and new learning increases the feelings of vulnerability. Basically, we are always asking all of our students to trust us, to come into vulnerable territory with us. Let me give you something that you don't even know you can do, that you don't think you can do. Let me lead you into that and help you to realize you can do more than you thought. These students, oh my goodness, they are going to instinctively avoid doing anything that leads them into vulnerable territory. They're not going to try new things. They're not going to ask questions. They're not going to give their original ideas. They're not going to explore the unknown. And for the most part, they're the ones that are going to lead the chorus in the classroom. That's boring. We did that. Let's say you're teaching Sec 1 or Sec 2 or even Sec 3, and they'll look at you and mock you by saying, we learned that in kindergarten. What they're basically saying is, I'm scared. If what you teach right now is going to be so hard for me, I'm going to look really dumb in front of other people. They can't look at their own mistakes. And yet the only way we can learn is by looking at our mistakes. It's going to make them feel too vulnerable. They're just going to throw away that thing. They're not going to come they're not going to look to see what they did wrong. They're not going to ask for help about that. They don't admit to their inaccuracy and ignorance. They don't confess. They might be very confused, but they won't do, they'll just sit and do nothing for an hour. And you come to them and privately and say, could I help you? And if you're lucky, they might say, oh, I didn't understand the task. Well, why didn't you raise your hand? Well, because if they raise their hand, guess what? They're going to show everybody that they're inadequate and they can't handle that. And then the other thing which happens is that because they can't feel sad about what's not working, then their brain gets stuck in their learning disabilities and they can't do the workarounds. We all have brains that don't work right. We all have things that we've had to learn to work around, how figuring out how to read a map. My husband says, well, just go north. And I go, I don't understand where north is. Tell me where it is on the map. Is it up or is it down? Right? And he just rolls his eyes because he instinctively knows where north, south, east, and west are. No, it doesn't work that way. Montreal is really lovely because north is the mountain, south is the river. Okay, I can orient myself. Well, we work around it. But if you can't feel sad about it and you don't want to look stupid, then you're going to get stuck in that learning disability. So here we are dealing with this big mess that these kids are dealing with. And so it's not going to be easy to intervene with them. I'll take a breath here, Catherine. I don't know if you wanted to share a little something.
Yeah, I had a student in mind as you were talking before about the turning on you when they share something vulnerable. And I remember when I was a coordinator of a high school program, it probably was a grade 7 student, and he was fairly new to the program, and very quickly at first would share certain things about, was tough at home with mom and dad, and disappointments that he had, and he wasn't happy to be in that program and whatnot. And I felt that I was doing a good job as a professional because he was opening up and wanting my help and my suggestions in that. And one morning he came in, and after he had shared more than I had anticipated, and thought, okay, so now I've got this student, we'll be able to do some more work. And it's actually, I got surprised that when he come in the next morning, completely different child, didn't want to look at me, started parroting, like when they repeat what you're saying, and it like making fun of me basically. And I couldn't understand where this was coming from, like it seemed. And I was trying to go back in my mind, like, where did I go wrong? What did I do that brought this out into the student? And it took weeks and weeks before we could find any type of somewhat of some conversation. And sadly for the student, the only way that conversation came out again was because he was numbing himself with substance use, and that's why he was able to share. But I didn't know this paradigm at the time, and so had I known, I would have been in a such different position to make sense of it, and the way I would have approached it probably would have been different. So
Yes. And you can't prevent a student from sharing things with you, but you can
Right.
certainly prepare yourself for that boomerang reaction. I know that when I worked at Western Quebec at the Lindsay Place program for adolescents and severe, with great behavior problems, the psychiatrists who didn't understand this paradigm would sometimes say, "Oh, yours is an attachment-based approach. Oh, no, this student can't go there." Because they have reactive attachment disorder, which means that they reject attachment. By the way, anybody who's been dealing with a student who has reactive attachment disorder, it's exactly in this level of defense that these children are. And many of them, it's because they've lived in orphanages for many years and didn't have safe attachments. But I basically said to the staff who were there, but we're going to get ready for it. We don't like it. It hurts. But we're going to prepare ourselves for it, and we're going to work around that. We're not going to let that put us off. And so we sometimes convinced the psychiatrist to send us one of these students for whom it is inappropriate to use attachment as the solution. Broke my heart whenever I heard that. Yeah. So when we're intervening, this is not going to be easy because, as you all know, we have our usual things that we tell you to do. And many of our workshops, until you get to this level, many of our interventions are going to work nicely with the whole class and individually and what have you. But these students, you got to walk very, very carefully. So I'm going to say the same things, but I'm going to put a lot of riders onto it. Reduce alarm by gently providing attachment. We'll talk about how to do that. Compensate for the defendedness and the immaturity by providing external structure and support. And the word I'm going to use a little later on is unobtrusively. Make it there, but don't make it obvious. If they need physical and emotional release, and they will, these are the kinds of kids that if you do these great, wonderful emotional release things in the classroom, they're going to sit at the back of the room and cross their arm and look at you like, yeah, I'm not doing that. But they still need the physical and emotional release, so we've got to do it privately with them. We have to be very patient with their defenses, and we do need to protect their vulnerability, but it's tough because they're always going to try and go underneath and catch our vulnerability. So here are some of the thoughts that I had. And by the way, this whole presentation is thanks to Catherine's input. She and I worked literally slide by slide through this material. And so Catherine, I think we'll have enough time to go through this. So if you want to add anything, please do. So basically, see the alarm and the elevated emotion. Remember that they don't look alarmed and emotional. Many of these students, as I say, you get it that there's something else going on here because it's different. But they just look kind of like sometimes, and I've been fooled. We had one boy, I was telling Catherine, he was in grade 5 or grade 6, probably about grade 5. And we had weeks and weeks of really good stuff going on with him. Good in the sense that he didn't get into trouble. What we didn't realize was he was shutting down. So of course he didn't get into trouble because he was numbing out. Except that when things got really bad, then he'd have one of these big explosions. And we fought, it took us a long time. His separation came from the fact that his father would pick up his sisters and not him on the weekend, even to the point where he told the children in front of this boy, "I'll take the girls this summer, but I'm not going to take you." And it took 3 days before that emotional turmoil that happened blew up in the school. He actually is the only child that I dealt with. I mean, many of them probably have, but he actually broke a window in the school, which I've never seen happen before. But that's how explosive it was when it came out. But everybody said, but he's been having a good week. So they don't look emotional. The unmotivated, challenging behavior comes from a sea of emotion that's defended against, right? The chemistry is there, but it's masked by these defenses, and they sometimes don't look like they need us, or they're going to actively push us away, but they do need more attachment. But we've got to be very careful how we do it. My son had a hedgehog. We're not allowed to have them in Quebec, by the way. We smuggled it in from Ontario. And but they're the cutest little animals. Oh my goodness, they're so sweet. And that little nose goes back and forth, just charming. But his was the rejected baby of the bunch. And when we adopted it, the person said, "Oh, good luck," because you can actually, the prickles are very prickly. But eventually you can pick a hedgehog up and actually smooth them. When the prickles are down, you can actually pet the hedgehog. But this little guy was so alarmed that he would do this. And those it hurts your hand. And my son, his heart was broken. He's such a gentle fellow, and his heart was broken, but he worked with this little hedgehog for 2 years, and then he finally got him. But remember, this is what our kids are like. They put those spines up to just protect a very, very tender heart in there. So yes, we need to provide attachment, cultivate that relationship, see if we can get into their space in some way. But we've got to do this every day in a very conscious way with these students. Greet with warmth, often some kind of an activity. That's why a puzzle table is so helpful, even in a high school classroom. A riddle on just something, some little way of connecting. Catherine, you did that with one. This was online, right?
For sure. I had a student prior to pandemic that I was working with on a regular basis. And when pandemic hit, we were meant to do some work online. And I think that, given the anxiety of the pandemic, but also the physical distance made it really difficult for him, even though we had, more than 1 year of working regularly together. It wasn't conducive for him to be comfortable and to want to do it online. And so I didn't give up. I even through the mother, I would try to find a way to tell him, I'm still here, I'm still thinking about you, I haven't forgotten you. And I would send these riddles through mom to get him to guess what the answer was. And I remember at first he didn't want to engage in the play. He kept on saying how silly and stupid these riddles were. But the fact that he said that they were stupid and silly means that he's actually read them. So at least I was getting some sort of engagement, and I didn't give up. And at some point, the riddles got us to being able to go online, and then we were able to move forward. But yeah, like the more that it's about your agenda and that we push, the more that they retreat. And so how to so gently. And I was lucky that I had a good rapport with mom, and that so I used mom as the matchmaker.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah.
Sometimes, things like, yeah, like leaving a little note for them, or yeah. So we got to get underneath those defenses, right? These are the kinds of kids we have to, if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, just gently find a way to get them to do it. And just remember that for them, attachment increases the possibility of rejection. So they might, just like Catherine did, he kept saying it was dumb, it was silly, but actually if she didn't send them, then he'd start thinking, well, why isn't she sending them to me? So
Exactly.
every single day these are the kinds of kids you need to go, if they're not looking at you, just go by and say hi, just let them know. This whole collect before you direct, but it has to be very gentle with them. These are not the kinds of kids, and some of you do this, are so lovely. You have such warm faces and smiling and so positive and have such an energy. And of course, you might have a class of 20 or 25 students, and 23 of them love that warmth. But for one or two of them, that's way too much. So you got to dial it back, and just a little smile, just a little nod, and just how can I get that little, and you see the face of this young woman here. It's not much of a look, but she's there, but that's good enough. That's got to be good enough. And when they look up at us, we don't have to have a big smile, but just a little bit of warmth, and just, is there a little something going on? And bit by bit, you pull that person into your orbit so that then you can.
If I may add for a
Yeah.
second, some of these students that they tend to have the hair, that hide the eyes, or they'll put the hoodie on, and sometimes, I'll observe teachers that will ask them to remove the hoodie, or to move the hair, and will ask for the student to look at them. And,
Yeah.
and so and so in degree, being careful that we're not in their space too much where they feel overwhelmed in that you can connect with a student being side by side, like. So the idea of the puzzle where you're each kind of doing a part of it, and you can chit chat in a very nonchalant type of way, can bring it together without feeling like they're being stared at.
Now, eye contact for for
Hmm.
all of us is vulnerable, but many of us are okay with it. But yes, shoulder to shoulder is way better. And for me, I said to people, you learn to read the nonverbal signs. If that kid comes to school and the hoodie is here and the hair is down to here and you can't see their face, what are they telling us? They're just like the hedgehog, saying, my world is too much. Oh my goodness. And let's understand that it's a message that they're giving us, and that we shouldn't be, taking, we should be just recognizing. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So yeah, it's going to be hard to collect these students because of, all the ways in which they push us away. So if they're mumbling, I had one situation like that with a teacher. It was a little bit slightly different situation, but it was a defended students. And the teacher came in. I was in the office. We were in the office talking, and it was, was a fun kind of a thing. Recess was over, and it's a high school student, and the teacher said it was at the program for, we only had a few students, and the teacher came in and says, time to come back to class. And interestingly enough, the student actually went back to class, and he was like about 6'1" and she's about 5'1", and if he refused to come back, there's nothing either of us could have done. But he did come back, but he walked right by me and he mumbled under his breath. I can't remember what he mumbled, but it was stuff that wasn't appropriate, and we kind of heard it, but we didn't. And she just kind of looked at me, and I just basically went like this, and kind of, I'm deaf, I didn't hear it. He was obeying her. He was going into class. Let's just forget about what he was saying. So we have to also remember, attachment feels vulnerable, better to reject than be rejected. And they're also waiting for this kindness to turn into the yeah, but, because they know they haven't gotten the work done. They know they know there's part of them that kind of instinctively knows they're not being very good, but they can't handle it, right? And so our response should be like just keeping greeting, doing things, little things, walk side by side, just say hello, something little, ignore that nonverbal. And sometimes just say, like if the hoodie is up and the hair is down to here and they're hiding like that, just something like, ooh, kind of a bad day today. No problem. It's okay. I'm here. And then walk away. Don't stay close by, because it's too much for them. But Dr. Neufeld calls that touching the bruises. You drop in a little bit when they're not expecting it, when their defenses are kind of, because defenses come and go. When the defenses are, they're there, and you come beside them and you go, oh, tough day today, and you walk away. It's kind of like, oh, they didn't have a chance to put the defense up, and yet they've heard, oh, you get that I'm having a tough day. Probably what will happen is the hoodie will go up a little bit, the bangs will go over, right? And that's about as much as they can handle at this moment in time. We have to try and be aware of this vicious cycle that some of these students get into, of always seeing people that are upset with them. But remember, when they look at us, we have to kind of keep it a little neutral-ish, right? Just give a nod, little thumbs up, keep it low. Turning on you, oh my goodness, is that ever hurtful? You found that hurtful with that student when he turned on you and mimicked you and mocking you. But we have to remember again that they've been betrayed by people. So it's not personal. It's not about you. It's about what other people have done. Better to reject than be rejected, right? But it's also as well that they're using this as a way to increase attachment, these superficial attachments. I know the students who really, have started to develop a caring, warm relationship with an adult will go out into the hallway and will say in a very loud voice to the other student, oh, that was so dumb. She was being so dumb in there. You guys just had a wonderful session. But they're trying to attract the attachment of the other people by creating this polarity. So it's hard. Go and talk to somebody else, cry your tears and sadness, talk about your hurt, but recognize that, boy, if they push us away, who do they have left in their lives, right? So you might have to, if it's public, you might have to red flag that behavior, but really try and come alongside if you can. It probably took you a few days, right, Catherine, to find any softness in you for this guy. But even if it's a few days later, remember how hurt these kids are. And then the lashing out, of course, there's all that sea of emotion underneath. There's all under that share of, saying, I don't care. There's all sorts of frustration. My poor William, when he, his father would promise to come on the weekend, then not come. And then when he would come, he'd pick up the girls and not him, or he'd pick the girls up on their weekend and not him on his weekend, and it would be up and down like this for him. But the clincher was when the father said flat out to the mother, I'm not taking him for the summer. Well, he held it in for 3 days and then he just let it out. It had to come out, and luckily at this point, the mother was telling us what was going on with him. So I wish she had told us before it happened, but at least we understood why it happened. And so again, yes, we need to put it to school-based discipline. Of course, he was suspended. Everybody saw the broken window, something had to happen. But really, we need to sit down with the kid. It's not going well for you. And some of them will say, I don't know where it came from. Younger children will actually talk about having a demon inside of them. I don't know where that came from. There must be a demon inside of me. I didn't do that on purpose. Where did that come from? Because their defenses are so, they can't feel the emotion rising. It just comes out. And so it can be quite upsetting. Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, this was more around the trauma kids, but I say these are the trauma kids. They finally changed the way in which they reacted to kids who were exploding, didn't take it personally, and really tried to come alongside by, are you, taking them out privately? Something's not working. We get it. What can I do to help? And they did a whole movie on it called Paper Tigers, and it just turned their school around. It really does make a difference. We had one student, again, many ways in which this can be manifested. He was so defended that all he did was sit. And this was again at Lindsay Place in the early days of Lindsay Place. Luckily, we were given a lot of leeway in terms of what we could do. This boy basically for months on end just sat on the couch, refused to go to class, refused to go anywhere, but came to school, would sit on the couch basically in a stupor. He had some relationship with the woman that was working with there, and it was okay, but he just couldn't do very much. Fascinatingly, about 5 years later or 4 years later, because his brother ended up in the program as well, and so she went to meet the mother and to talk about the younger brother, and the older brother was on the porch, came dashing off the porch, gave her a huge hug and said thank you, and then turned to his friend and said, "This is the woman that saved my life." And it was Tracy Charles was working at the program, a wonderful woman, and Tracy said, "I did." I said, "You didn't do anything." He says, "You let me sit on the couch when that was all I could do." And oh my goodness, and he was actually working. He had been working, and he was able to move forward, but he needed that year. So we have to sometimes know that just being there for these kids makes a huge difference. When we can't handle them anymore, yeah, sometimes we need to, send them to somebody else. And you guys know this, just find some elegant way of getting them out of the room and let them know that everything is okay. Bridging, always being able to say, "See you tomorrow, we'll find a better way, focus on the next point of contact." I say here, and I really thought about this sentence, give them the message no matter what they do or how they behave, adults will find a way to care for them. Sometimes they do stuff that is really foul, but we have to keep trying to give them some kind of hope. I'm going to find you some kind of a program. You might not be ready right now for help, but when you get older, you'll be able to find help. It's the hope that we have to keep giving to them. When we follow up with them one-on-one, focus gently on feelings, not just on what actually happened. Depersonalize the incident. This is difficult. That was a difficult situation. And again, gentle, gentle, gentle. There was lots that wasn't working for you. Convey that the relation, we're okay. We'll get through this. If they want to invent, oh yeah, when somebody uses that word, that really gets you going. Maybe you could try coming and talking to me instead. But the main thing here is when you see the defenses going up, when you see the eyes glazing over, when the hoodie goes up, back off. This is not the time to talk. Oh, and just find a dignified way. Oh, I'm really sorry. I have to go right now. We'll talk again tomorrow. Don't get put off by the defenses, but it's not easy. It's not easy. Use your school team to talk about these kids, to figure out what else you can do, to share the responsibility, find somebody else. That's when you use the envelope and say, "Oh, you know what? Could you please bring this to the secretary, or could you please bring this to the guidance counselor?" Where the message basically is, "I've had it with him. His behavior is driving me crazy." And the other person says, "Thank you." And it's just a way of doing that, where we share the burden of these really challenging kids. Try and use the adult resources. Secretaries, by the way, can be quite wonderful, some of them. And do try and find one key adult that will be kind of the key person for this particular student.
You had
Yeah,
before you move forward, these are the types of students that if our goal is to keep them in class, it will be difficult for everybody. And so the goal is not to keep them necessarily functioning in class, it's to be able to keep them at school. And so making a nuance from in class to at school. And if we can work as a team, because they are hard to handle, it becomes heavy over time, that if we can share that load, it really does make that difference.
exactly. So again, unobtrusively give them what they might need. If they're missing a pencil or paper or whatever, just give it to them, but don't make a comment about it. Sometimes you need to think about, okay, they need a little bit of help, because when you are feeling so unmotivated, like sometimes you just need to say, do one paragraph, do a little bit, like just work with them about making it more manageable for them, giving them extra time or what you can. But it really, you just want to get them through the day so they don't get into more trouble by all the things that they don't. We need to anticipate where the difficulty is going to be. How can we keep them out of trouble? Do we need to keep them in, when everybody's in the hallway, keep them in with us, and just try and find where the problematic situations are, and sometimes even limiting the time that they are with their peers. Keep them away from trouble rather than giving them a consequence for trouble, because these kids don't. Consequences really do not work with them at all, especially for elementary, because we often, grade 5, grade 6, these kids show these signs. Don't use behavior charts with them, because they can't tell when they're going to misbehave. By the time they've noticed they've misbehaved, it's too late. Reward systems and they're usually the ones who say, this is stupid, I don't really care about those prizes anyway. So why even do that? And don't send notes home. I remember one poor father, long story, I don't want to tell the story, but it's really important. One little boy, grade 6 boy, come back to his teacher and said, please don't put another red face in my calendar, in my agenda, because my dad says he's going to beat me. And I said to this, oh, you got to call the social worker. And she said, social worker's already involved. This is a single dad and he's on workman's compensation. And I said, oh, I know what's going on. His dad doesn't know how to fix his kid anymore. So he's going to the last ditch thing that he can do. I said, please, let's not do that anymore. Do not send that. Just write a note every day, find something positive about what the kid did and write that note to the dad, because the dad's trying to fix the kid for you. And he's going off the deep end. Obviously, he doesn't know what else to do. So really, we need to figure out as a team what we can do to help these kids figure it out. Make sure that everybody knows if we're looking at some kind of a solution. The guiding principle should be, we need to keep other children safe. Sometimes we do need to do things for the other students, but what can we do to help the student have a better day? And the most important thing for me is, how do we help the student feel hopeful about their future? So we're trying to keep that heart soft. As we know, behavior changes when the brain matures, when vulnerability is protected, when they're attached to the adults, and when emotions are felt. We have our website. Most of you know it by now. If you go to the members website, we have a whole page on defended and hard to reach. And so please go to that. We have a worksheet on it. Again, hard to read on the handout that you have, but please download it. Don't forget, we have a Q&A for, actually, this is specifically for students who have challenges, developmental challenges, but I think anybody can come if they want to. Neuroscience of Play on May the 5th, and Helping the Highly Sensitive Child on May 26th. And you also have a resource list. I will stop sharing here because at least we have 6 or 7 minutes for questions. Hopefully it helped to make a little bit of sense of these really, really challenging, upsetting students.
Mm-hmm. Please feel free if you have any questions, any thoughts. I imagine those that came to this session today, of course, may have some specific students in mind.
And those of you that are working as professionals at your school board, so if you're in a consultative role, psychologist, a behavior specialist, whatever role you are, we will be having a Q&A on, do you remember the date?
I'll tell you. Give me a moment. It is coming up on Wednesday next week. So on April 13th at 3:30 p.m. until depending on how many people show up and how much we talk. So until 5. Yeah.
So if you are, please register for that so that we make sure, the link, so we can send you the link if you're not already registered, and we will we can look more at particularly challenging cases that you might your schools might be bringing to you. I am going to upload here. Oops, hang on.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, good.
Ready?
Okay.
Oh, you want to upload the
yeah, I've got it now. I think I'm okay there. This is the evaluation. Yeah. So Laura says, you mentioned playing puzzles games with a student. How can you build a relationship with them when you refuse to pay? Oh, well, you see, this is where you don't invite them to actually do it. And again, it might not happen. I mean, you might have to try all different. This is again where less is more with these kinds of kids. Is you kind of put puzzles at the back, and you just kind of see what they gravitate to, or I know one teacher, one young female teacher had a very difficult male student in her class, and she didn't know what to do with him. But she knew he was really interested in motorcycles. And so she basically bought a magazine, a motorcycle magazine, and put it on her desk. Didn't say anything to him. Well, he liked motorcycles, so came on, what's this thing doing on your desk? She said, well, my nephew is thinking about buying a motorcycle, so I thought I wanted to find out something about motorcycles, but I don't really know very much about them. And then she walked away. Like, you have to really be cool. You have to act as if you don't care whether they care or not. But you got to find some little thing that kind of interests them, and then sidle along and go, oh, I think that piece might go there, and then, oh yeah, well, this is a tough one, and then walk away. But yeah, these kids will do everything to push us away, because they figure, I might as well push you away before you push me away. It's tough. It's tough. Oh yes, Tracy is pretty amazing person. Yeah.
Pretending to using common grounds and common interest. Exactly.
Yeah.
You've got it, Marie-Christine. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you have to be authentic. I mean, she had to, but she really wanted a relationship with this kid, so she was going to do whatever she could to figure it out. And again, it's the reason why I told you that story about Tracy was because Tracy honestly believed that she hadn't gotten very far with this kid. She hadn't gotten him back into class, which was one of the goals of the program, back into academics. But we never know. Some of you maybe have had that experience. Years later, you'll run across a student that you really didn't think you got very far with, and said, miss or sir, I remember that you said hello to me every single day. And you were absolutely certain that they were, so just remember that some of these students are so hungry, and yet it's so hard to feed them. But we still have to keep giving them crumbs, whatever little crumbs we can, to let that just kind of go in that somebody did care.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Catherine and I could both tell you stories of why some of these students end up like this. Like the situations, the circumstances that they come from can be heartbreaking. And school is often the safest place, but school is overwhelming to them. It's too much.
For sure.
But we still have to believe that we have a power, the ability.
I see this in private practice with parents, children that defend from their parents as well. I have a situation right now, dad using substance abuse, and actually went into a home to help himself get out of it. And when he came back, daughter couldn't handle it, and it's been months and months that dad, because the parents are separated, and dad writing to the daughter, and the daughter zero response. And I said to dad, keep on writing, keep on writing. Don't give up. Even though she doesn't respond, she would wonder why you're not writing if you stop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Kids need us. And honestly, they need us, the mature people in their lives. And so we just keep hoping that they will reach out. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we are at our time. So thank you very much, everyone. I know it's not easy to come at this time of day. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And again, for those of you that are listening to the recording, do complete the feedback survey as well. It's helpful to us.
Oh,
so
yes,
wishing
please.
you all the best, and hope to see you at one of our next events. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.